Daniel Foster was 34 years old when his father opened the front door of the only house he had ever called home, looked him directly in the eye, and told him he was uneducated trash who didn't deserve the Foster name. Then he closed the door. Daniel stood on that porch for 11 minutes before he accepted that no one was opening it again. Daniel had a steady trade career, his own home, and no debt. He had never asked his parents for a dollar since he was 22 years old. The uneducated his father threw at him that night had nothing to do with money, and nothing, really, to do with education. It was the excuse Richard Foster had been waiting 17 years to use, because the truth underneath it was something Richard and Carol Foster had been hiding since the week Daniel was born. This is the story of a man who spent 34 years trying to earn a place in a family that had decided, long before he could talk, that he would never fully belong, and what he found when he finally stopped trying to earn it and started asking why. It ends with Daniel standing on a different porch, in a different state, being welcomed by people who had been looking for him for just as long as he didn't know to look for them. 3 weeks after that night on the porch, Daniel found a folder in a box his parents had asked him to store in his garage years earlier. It had his name on it. It was dated the year he was born. And it was not a birth certificate. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before we get to what was inside that folder, I need you to hold 3 questions in your mind because everything in this story is really an answer to one of them. First, why would a father wait 17 years to call his son uneducated trash over a trade career he had known about the entire time? Daniel became an HVAC technician at 17, with his parents' full knowledge, and at the time, no objection. The insult that ended their relationship wasn't really about his job. It was about something Richard had been sitting on, getting angrier about in private for almost 2 decades. Second, what was actually in that folder? It wasn't a birth certificate, and it wasn't anything Daniel had ever been shown before. We'll get to exactly what it said, but I'll tell you this much now. Once Daniel read it, he understood, for the first time in his life, why he had always felt like a guest in his own home. And third, who is Victoria Hale? And why has she spent 34 years looking for someone she's never met? There is a woman in North Carolina who has thought about a specific date in October for 34 years, every single year, without ever knowing what became of the choice she made on it. This story is about to become hers just as much as it is Daniel's. One more thing before we go back to the beginning. Michael Foster, Daniel's older brother, knew the truth before Daniel did. He had known it for over a decade. And he never said a single word. Daniel Foster was adopted by Richard and Carol Foster when he was 11 days old through a private arrangement facilitated by a county adoption agency in Columbus, Ohio. He grew up knowing this in the abstract way that children know facts about themselves that adults have decided are not worth dwelling on. His parents told him, when he was old enough to ask, that his birth mother had been very young and not in a position to raise a child, and that the adoption had been closed, meaning no identifying information had been exchanged in either direction. That was the entire conversation, repeated almost verbatim every few years whenever Daniel raised it, for the rest of his childhood. Daniel's adoption was acknowledged at family gatherings only when extended relatives asked directly, and even then, Carol would change the subject within a sentence or two. Daniel learned by around age 9 that asking questions about it made the room uncomfortable in a way he didn't yet have words for. Michael, his older brother by 3 years, was Richard and Carol's biological son. The age gap and the obvious physical differences between the brothers were never directly addressed in the household, but Daniel has said he remembers being aware, from a very young age, that he and Michael were treated as fundamentally different categories of son, not cruelly, not yet, but distinctly. That distinction would calcify slowly, year after year, into something that eventually had a name. Daniel just wouldn't hear that name out loud until he was 34 years old. Richard Foster spent 32 years as a public school administrator in suburban Columbus, working his way from teacher to assistant principal to district administrator through, by his own account, relentless personal discipline and advanced degrees earned over 2 decades of night classes. He measured almost everything in his life, including the people in it, against a single standard: formal educational achievement. Carol, a former librarian, shared this framework completely and reinforced it constantly, treating Richard's standards less as his personal philosophy and more as simple, obvious fact. Michael was enrolled in advanced placement courses starting in middle school, with tutors hired whenever his grades dipped even slightly. Daniel, who struggled with a diagnosed but lightly managed learning difference in reading comprehension, was given comparatively little academic support and was instead steered, gently at first and then more directly, toward vocational coursework. By the time he reached high school, a track Richard would later weaponize against him almost as if he had not been the one to suggest it. Daniel excelled in his vocation. Richard and Carol had not just kept this information from Daniel. They had been asked directly, in writing, by his birth mother, to give it to him if he ever wanted it. They never did. Daniel called his mother 3 weeks after the eviction, the first contact of any kind since that Sunday, and asked her to meet him, not at the house, but at a neutral coffee shop near her home. A choice he made deliberately, he has said, because he no longer trusted himself to have this conversation on their terms. He brought the folder. He placed Victoria's letter on the table between them without saying anything at first, and watched his mother's face as she recognized it. Carol has since described that moment, in a conversation she gave permission to reference, as the moment I understood that 34 years of carefully managing this story was finally, completely over. Carol told Daniel that she and Richard had received Victoria's letter at the time of the adoption and had made a deliberate decision together never to share it or any identifying details with Daniel, out of a stated concern that contact with his birth mother would confuse his sense of who his real family was. She acknowledged, when Daniel pressed her, that this decision had never been revisited or reconsidered in 34 years, despite Daniel asking about his origins multiple times throughout his childhood and adolescence. Daniel asked her directly whether the decision to withhold the letter had anything to do with the way he had always been treated differently than Michael. Carol did not answer the question directly. She has said since that she did not have an honest answer that didn't implicate her and Richard in something she wasn't ready, at that point, to fully admit to herself. Daniel asked one more question before he left the coffee shop that day. He asked whether Richard had ever planned to tell him any of this. Carol's answer was 4 words long, and Daniel has said it was the moment he finally let go of trying to repair the relationship at all. Carol told Daniel, no, never, he couldn't. When Daniel asked what that meant, Carol explained, for the first time, that Richard had never fully reconciled himself to raising a child who was not biologically his, not because of any specific event, but as a quiet, persistent discomfort he had carried since the adoption itself, one that Carol had spent over 3 decades managing, smoothing over, and ultimately enabling rather than confronting. She told Daniel that Richard's escalating comments about education and credentials over the years had never really been about education at all, that they were, in her words, a socially acceptable way for him to say the thing he could never bring himself to say directly, which was that he had never fully accepted Daniel as equally his son. Carol acknowledged that this dynamic had shaped nearly every comparison between Daniel and Michael throughout their childhood, not because Michael had done anything to earn preferential treatment, but because Richard's biological connection to Michael had always functioned, in Richard's own unexamined framework, as a kind of validation that Daniel could never provide regardless of what he achieved. Daniel left that conversation with the full shape of something he had felt, in fragments, for his entire life, now confirmed in total. He has said the strange relief of finally understanding why was almost immediately replaced by a colder, more practical question. What was he going to do with that understanding? The first thing he did was contact the agency that had handled his adoption 34 years earlier, and an unexpected former caseworker named Linda Morales was about to tell him something Carol didn't even know. Linda Morales had retired from the county adoption agency 8 years earlier, after a 31-year career, but remained listed as a contact for record requests involving older, pre-digital case files. When Daniel called the agency's general line, his case was unusual enough: a fully closed adoption with a birth parent's explicit written request for future contact on file for over 3 decades, that the current staff redirected him to Linda directly, since she had personally handled his file in the early 1990s. Linda has said she remembered Daniel's case specifically, even decades later, because Victoria's letter had been unusual at the time. Most birth parents in closed adoptions of that era did not leave detailed, signed requests for future contact, And the ones who did were rarely honored quickly when their children eventually came looking, due to the legal and procedural caution agencies exercised around closed adoptions. Linda confirmed that Victoria Hale had, in fact, contacted the agency twice in the decades since the adoption, once when Daniel turned 18 and once again when he turned 30, specifically asking whether her son had ever inquired about her, and leaving updated contact information each time in case he ever did. Both times, agency policy required that this information only be shared if Daniel initiated contact first. Daniel never had, because he never knew there was anything to ask about. Daniel has said learning that his birth mother had reached out twice, on her own, across 3 decades, without ever once being told whether he was even alive or had any interest in finding her, was one of the most emotionally overwhelming moments of the entire experience. More than the folder, more than Carol's admission. It was the first concrete evidence he had that someone, somewhere, had been hoping for this conversation for as long as he had unknowingly needed it. Linda gave Daniel Victoria's most recent contact information that same afternoon. Daniel sat in his truck in the agency parking lot for nearly 40 minutes before he worked up the nerve to call. Daniel called the number Linda had given him on a Thursday evening. Victoria Hale answered on the third ring. Daniel has said he had rehearsed an opening line in his head dozens of times in the truck and could not remember a single word of it once she said hello. He introduced himself eventually by saying only, "My name is Daniel. I think I might be your son." Victoria has described what happened next as a silence that felt, to her, like it lasted several minutes, though Daniel has said it was closer to 10 seconds. She has said the first thing she felt was not shock exactly, because some part of her had been waiting for this exact call for 34 years. The first thing she felt, she has said, was simply, finally. Victoria told Daniel, in that first call, that she had thought about him every single year on his birthday, that she had reached out to the agency twice hoping he might one day ask about her, and that giving him up had been, in her words, the only decision in my entire life I have never stopped grieving, even though I have also never once regretted that he got a chance at a stable life because of it. Daniel has said that single sentence, grieving the decision while also believing it gave him a better life, was the first time anyone in this entire story had described giving him up, or raising him, in terms that felt like genuine, complicated love, rather than either abandonment or obligation. It was, he has said, almost disorienting in its sincerity after 34 years inside the foster family's framework. Victoria asked Daniel, near the end of that first call, if he would be willing to come to North Carolina. She told him there was someone else who had been hoping to meet him for almost as long as she had. Victoria Hale had not had an easy path after giving Daniel up at 19. She finished a business degree at a community college in Charlotte while working 2 jobs, eventually moving into commercial property management, and built, over the following 3 decades, a successful regional development company specializing in renovating aging shopping centers into mixed-use retail spaces. She never told anyone outside her immediate family about the son she had given up as a teenager, carrying that history privately for over 30 years. Victoria married in her late 20s, had a daughter, Samantha, 4 years later, and built what she has described as a deliberately stable, transparent family life, one in which she made a specific decision, after Daniel, to never withhold significant truths from her own children, regardless of how difficult those truths might be to share. Victoria's husband passed away 8 years before Daniel's call, from a sudden cardiac event, leaving her to raise Samantha largely on her own through her teenage years while continuing to run her company. By the time Daniel called, Victoria was 61 years old, financially secure, and, by every account from people close to her, had never stopped wondering, quietly, what had become of the baby she had given up in a Charlotte hospital room in the early 1990s. Samantha, Daniel's half-sister, was the someone Victoria had mentioned on that first call. And Samantha had grown up knowing about Daniel her entire life, which meant, for 29 years, she had been the only person in either family who knew the full truth on both sides. Daniel flew to Charlotte 12 days after that first phone call. Victoria and Samantha met him at the airport, and Daniel has said the first thing he noticed getting off the plane was that Samantha was holding a sign with his name on it, not because he needed help finding them, but because, as Samantha later explained, she had wanted him to have a moment, walking up the terminal, where the first thing he saw was someone who had been specifically waiting for him. Samantha had grown up hearing about Daniel in fragments her entire childhood, not as a secret exactly, but as an ongoing quiet thread in the family's life, marked every year on his birthday, when Victoria would light a candle and say simply, "Wherever he is, I hope he's all right." Samantha has said she grew up assuming she would likely never meet him, and that the reality of his actual presence in the airport took her several minutes to fully process. That evening, at Victoria's home, Daniel was introduced to extended Hale family members who had gathered specifically to meet him: aunts, cousins, and Victoria's own mother, who, in a detail Daniel found unexpectedly moving, apologized to him directly and unprompted for the pressure she had placed on Victoria 34 years earlier, a pressure she had spent decades regretting privately. Daniel has described that first dinner as the strangest and most emotionally significant evening of his life. A room full of people who shared his blood, who had been thinking about him for 3 decades, and who treated his arrival not as an obligation to be managed, but as something to genuinely celebrate. He has said it was the first time in his life he understood, viscerally, what it might have felt like to never have to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. 2 days into that visit, Victoria told Daniel something about his career and about the Hale family's business that he had not been expecting at all. Victoria's commercial development company had, for several years, been struggling to find reliable, knowledgeable contractors for the mechanical and HVAC systems work involved in the kind of large-scale retail renovation projects that made up most of her business. A specific, well-compensated niche within commercial construction that required exactly the kind of advanced technical certification Daniel had spent over a decade building. Victoria did not offer Daniel a job out of charity, and both of them have been careful in subsequent interviews to clarify this point specifically. She offered him a position because his actual professional qualifications solved a real, expensive problem her company had been managing inefficiently for years. Daniel's advanced commercial refrigeration and HVAC system certification, the exact credential his father had dismissed as a little certificate weeks earlier, was precisely the expertise her business needed. Daniel relocated to North Carolina 4 months after that first visit, taking a director-level position overseeing mechanical systems for Hale Development's renovation projects, a role that came with a salary increase of approximately 60% over his previous position, full equity participation in future projects, and, more significantly to Daniel, the experience of having his specific expertise treated as genuinely valuable rather than as a consolation prize for not pursuing a 4-year degree. Within his first year at Hale Development, Daniel's technical input on mechanical systems planning saved the company an estimated $340,000 across 3 separate renovation projects by identifying systems inefficiencies and outdated equipment specifications that previous contractors had missed or ignored. Victoria has said, publicly, that hiring Daniel was the easiest business decision I made that year, completely separate from the fact that he is also my son. Daniel had spent 34 years being told that his trade career made him less than his brother. It took less than a year in North Carolina for that exact career to become one of the most valuable assets in a multi-million-dollar company run by the mother who had once been forced to give him up. Michael Foster contacted Daniel for the first time in nearly 5 months, shortly after news of Daniel's relocation and new position reached the extended Foster family through mutual relatives. He did not defend their parents. He has said, in a recorded conversation he gave Daniel permission to share publicly, that he called specifically to apologize for the 18 years of silence about what he had learned in that filing cabinet at 19. Michael told Daniel that he had spent those 18 years telling himself the secret wasn't his to release, and that he understood now, with the clarity of hindsight, that this reasoning had mostly served to protect his own comfort rather than any genuine principle. He acknowledged that he had benefited, consistently and significantly, from a family hierarchy he had quietly known was built on a foundation Daniel had never been allowed to see. Daniel did not immediately forgive Michael, and has said publicly that he is still working through what, if any, relationship is possible between them going forward. He has said he believes Michael's apology was sincere, but that sincerity and repaired trust are not the same thing, and that he is in no hurry to skip from one to the other simply because the conversation finally happened. The two brothers have spoken several times since that initial call, cautiously and without any specific plan for what their relationship will look like long-term. Daniel has described the current state of things as open, but not resolved, a phrase he has said applies in different ways to almost every relationship that survived the events of this story. Richard and Carol Foster have not spoken to Daniel since the coffee shop conversation. They have, however, recently reached out, through Michael rather than directly, asking whether Daniel would be willing to meet. Richard and Carol's outreach, 6 months after the eviction and roughly 2 months after Daniel's relocation to North Carolina, did not happen in a vacuum. Extended family members have since described a noticeable shift in how Richard discussed Daniel at gatherings during this period, from dismissive silence to a kind of defensive curiosity about exactly what Daniel's new position with Hale Development actually entailed, and how much it paid. Daniel has said he was aware, even before agreeing to a meeting, that his parents' interest was unlikely to be purely about reconciliation in the way he might once have hoped for. He has said this awareness didn't stop him from agreeing to meet them. It simply changed what he was hoping to get out of the conversation. Richard had retired the previous year on a fixed pension that, due to a series of investment losses in the years prior, was providing significantly less income than he and Carol had originally planned for. Several relatives have noted, independently, that Richard's renewed interest in reconnecting with Daniel coincided closely with these financial pressures becoming acute enough to affect the Fosters' day-to-day lifestyle. Daniel agreed to the meeting anyway, not because he believed it would go well, but because he wanted, finally, to hear what his father would actually say with the full truth sitting on the table between them. Daniel flew back to Ohio for the meeting, held at a restaurant neither family had any history with, another deliberate choice, Daniel has said, to avoid any location that might carry the emotional weight of the house he grew up in. Richard and Carol arrived first. Daniel has said his father looked smaller than he remembered, though he acknowledged this was likely as much about his own changed perspective as anything physically different about Richard. Richard opened the conversation, after several minutes of strained small talk, by saying he had been thinking a lot about what he'd said that day in the driveway, and that he wanted Daniel to know he hadn't meant for things to get this far. Daniel has said this opening line told him almost everything he needed to know about how the conversation was going to go, an acknowledgement of consequence, not of harm. Daniel asked Richard directly whether he regretted what he had said, or whether he regretted that Daniel had left and found a different family as a result. Richard did not answer immediately. When he did, he said, "I regret that it happened the way it happened." Daniel pressed him, asking whether he could say specifically that he regretted calling his own son uneducated trash. Richard's response, word for word, according to Daniel's account, "You know that's not really what I think of you." Daniel has said this was the moment he understood that a genuine apology was not coming, possibly was not available from his father at all. Carol, for her part, apologized more directly, for withholding Victoria's letter specifically, and for not pushing back harder against Richard's treatment of Daniel over the years. Daniel has said he believed Carol's apology was sincere, even as he recognized it had taken 34 years and the complete collapse of the relationship to arrive. Near the end of the meeting, Richard asked Daniel, somewhat abruptly, what his new role at Hale Development actually paid. Daniel has said this single question told him more about his father's priorities in that moment than anything said in the previous 45 minutes. Daniel told his father, calmly, that he wasn't going to discuss his salary, not because it was a secret, but because he had finally understood, sitting at that table, that the number itself was never actually the point of anything Richard had ever said to him, not the starter house comments, not the little certificates, and not the words on that porch 6 months earlier. The point, Daniel said, had always been about whether Richard could see him as fully, unconditionally his son. And Daniel told him directly that he no longer believed that was something Richard was capable of, regardless of any number attached to Daniel's career. Richard did not have a response to this. Daniel has said his father simply sat there for what felt like a long time, and then asked whether Daniel might consider visiting for the holidays. Daniel told him he would think about it. He has since said publicly that he did think about it, seriously, and ultimately declined that first holiday season, not out of spite, but because he wanted enough time to be certain that any future relationship with his parents was built on something more honest than convenience or financial anxiety. Daniel has said the meeting gave him something he hadn't expected going in. A clear, settled understanding that he did not need Richard's approval, retroactively or otherwise, in order to know his own worth. He has described this realization as more valuable, ultimately, than any apology Richard could have offered, because it didn't depend on Richard offering anything at all. Daniel left that restaurant and drove directly to the airport. He has not been back to Ohio since, though he has said carefully that not yet and never are not the same thing. 1 year after that first phone call to Victoria, Daniel has built a life in North Carolina that he has described more than once as the first time in his adult life that he has felt fully comfortable being exactly who he is. He has a home 20 minutes from Victoria's, a position at Hale Development that continues to grow in scope and responsibility, and a relationship with Samantha that has evolved from careful politeness into something closer to genuine sibling closeness, including, by Samantha's account, the kind of casual teasing that only happens once two people have stopped being careful with each other. Every year on Daniel's birthday, Victoria still lights the same candle she lit for 34 years while he was missing from her life. The tradition has not stopped now that he's present. It has simply changed meaning, from a private act of hope into something the whole family does together, with Daniel now in the room to see it for the first time. Daniel has said the hardest part of the entire experience in retrospect was not learning the truth about his adoption, and not even the eviction itself. It was unlearning, slowly and with real effort, 3 decades of believing that love had to be earned through achievement, a belief the foster household had instilled in him so thoroughly that it took an entirely new family, one that wanted nothing from him except his presence, to show him what the alternative actually felt like. Samantha has said, in her own account of the past year, that having Daniel in her life has changed her own relationship with her mother's history in ways she didn't anticipate. Growing up as the only person who knew the full truth about Daniel's existence, she has said, created a strange, isolating kind of responsibility, keeping a secret that wasn't fully hers, on behalf of a brother she had never met. She has said watching her mother and Daniel build a relationship over the past year has, in a real sense, allowed her to finally put that responsibility down. "I'm not carrying it for both of them anymore," she has said. "I just get to be his sister now. That's so much lighter than what I was doing before." This story gets remembered, when people share it, as a story about cruel parents and a happy ending. And it is that. But I think the more interesting story underneath it is about the specific, quiet violence of being loved conditionally for 34 years, without ever being told the condition existed. Richard Foster never once said, directly, that his discomfort with Daniel's adoption was the real source of his criticism. He hid it behind credentials and comparisons for over 3 decades, which meant Daniel spent his entire life trying to solve a problem that was never actually about him, and could never have been solved by him, no matter what he achieved. And I think the most important thing this story says about family isn't really about biology at all, even though biology is the mechanism that drives this particular plot. Victoria Hale didn't earn the right to call herself Daniel's mother by giving birth to him, any more than Carol Foster lost that right by raising him for 34 years. What separated the two households in the end wasn't blood. It was whether love came with an invoice attached. Victoria's love for a son she had never met came with nothing attached at all, sustained for 3 decades on nothing but hope and a candle lit once a year. Richard's love for the son he actually raised came, it turned out, with conditions Daniel had been trying and failing to meet since before he could walk. Daniel has said he doesn't think of what happened to him as a story about finding a better family. Exactly, because that framing makes it sound like a simple upgrade, and nothing about the last year has felt simple. He has said he thinks of it instead as finally being given the chance to find out what unconditional actually meant, after 34 years of only ever hearing the word used as a description of something he apparently hadn't received. There's a photograph from Daniel's first Thanksgiving with the Hale family, 11 months after that first phone call. In it, Daniel is sitting between Victoria and Samantha at a crowded table, mid-laugh at something just out of frame, completely unposed and unaware the photo was even being taken. Daniel has said it's his favorite photograph from the entire year, not because of the occasion, but because of his own expression in it. He looks, he has said, like someone who has stopped performing for an audience that was never going to be satisfied anyway, and has simply, finally, relaxed into being exactly who he already was. Before we go, I want to ask you something, because I think this story leaves a genuinely open question, and I'd rather hear your honest take than offer a tidy answer myself. Carol knew about Victoria's letter for 34 years and said nothing. Richard's discomfort with Daniel's adoption shaped an entire childhood, even though he never said it plainly until the very end. Both of them, in their own way, chose silence over honesty for decades, believing, probably, that they were protecting something by doing so. My question for you is this. Is there a version of honesty offered early enough that could have actually saved this family? Or had Richard's underlying feelings already made an equal, unconditional relationship with Daniel impossible, regardless of when the truth came out? Tell me where you land in the comments. I suspect the answer says less about this particular family than it does about how each of us defines what family is actually supposed to be. And if this story made you think about the difference between the families we're born into and the families we eventually choose, or are chosen by, you're going to want to see what we're covering next week. Because next week we're telling the story of a woman who spent 6 years estranged from her sister over a misunderstanding neither of them caused, and the voicemail, saved by accident for half a decade, that finally proved it. Subscribe so you don't miss it. We post a new true story every week. I'm your narrator. This has been Tales of Whisper. The family that raises you and the family that loves you unconditionally are supposed to be the same thing. When they're not, you are allowed to go looking for the second one. 1 year after Daniel Foster found the family his adoptive parents had spent 34 years hiding from him, he believed the worst of that story was already behind him. He was wrong, because the woman who first uncovered his adoption records was about to find something even she had missed. A single falsified line, dated 9 years earlier, that proved Richard Foster hadn't just stayed silent about Daniel's birth mother. He had actively made sure Daniel never found her. When Daniel turned 25, Victoria Hale tried to reach him for the second time in his life. The adoption agency's standard procedure required them to ask Richard, as Daniel's legal guardian of record, even into adulthood for certain older case files, whether Daniel had ever expressed interest in contact. Richard told them he had. He told them Daniel had been asked years earlier and had declined. None of that had ever happened. Daniel was never asked. He never declined anything. Richard invented the entire exchange, and the agency, following protocol, closed Victoria's request without ever telling either of them the truth. This is the story of what happened when Daniel found out his father hadn't simply failed to tell him the truth once. He had actively, deliberately, repeatedly made sure the truth stayed buried, even after Daniel was an adult fully capable of deciding for himself. It ends with a decision Daniel had almost made 12 months earlier, and finally, completely, made for real. Linda Morales found the falsified record by accident while pulling an entirely unrelated file for an agency audit. She almost didn't mention it to Daniel at all, because of what she was afraid it would do to him. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before we get to what Linda actually found, I need you to hold 3 questions in your mind, because everything in this story is really an answer to one of them. First, why did Richard lie to the adoption agency specifically when Daniel turned 25? 25 was not a random age. We'll show you exactly what was happening in Richard's life that year, and why a man who had spent 2 decades hiding behind silence suddenly needed to start actively lying instead. Second, did Victoria ever find out her second attempt had failed? She knew the agency had told her at the time that Daniel wasn't interested. She believed that for 9 years. What she's about to learn is that the rejection she grieved was never real, and grieving something that never happened is its own particular kind of devastating. And third, what does Daniel do with a father who didn't just fail him passively, but lied to keep him from his real family on purpose? 12 months ago, Daniel left a door open, however slightly, for some kind of future with Richard. This story is about what happens to that door once Daniel learns exactly how far his father was willing to go to keep it closed in the other direction. One more thing before we go back to where this actually starts. Michael Foster was 28 years old when this happened, already carrying the secret of Daniel's adoption for 9 years by that point. There's a real question, raised for the first time in this story, about whether Michael knew about this specific lie too. Daniel Foster turned 25 in a year that, by his own account, was quietly difficult in ways he didn't fully recognize at the time. He had been out of his parents' house for 3 years, building his HVAC career steadily, and had just ended a serious relationship that he has since said left him feeling, for the first time as an adult, genuinely alone. He has said, knowing now what he didn't know then, that a phone call from Victoria Hale that year might have changed the entire trajectory of the following decade. Records later obtained from the adoption agency confirm Victoria's formal request for contact was logged on March 14th, 9 years before Linda's discovery, 4 months after Daniel's 25th birthday, and 4 weeks after his breakup, a timing neither Daniel nor Victoria had any way of knowing about at the time. Daniel has said learning the timing, that his birth mother had reached out during one of the loneliest stretches of his adult life, at almost the exact moment he might have most needed to hear from her, was one of the hardest specific details to sit with once the full picture emerged. Richard knew about Daniel's breakup. Richard knew, in general terms, that Daniel was struggling that year. And 4 weeks after that breakup, Richard made a decision that had nothing to do with protecting Daniel from pain and everything to do with protecting something else. Richard Foster was 61 years old when Victoria's second contact request reached the adoption agency. He had retired from his school administration career 18 months earlier and was, by several family accounts, struggling visibly with the transition, describing himself, more than once at gatherings that year, by his former job title rather than in the present tense, a habit several relatives found quietly sad at the time without fully understanding why. Linda Morales, reviewing the agency's full file during her later audit, found a contemporaneous note from the caseworker who had processed Victoria's request that year, a brief procedural record indicating that Richard had specifically asked during the phone call where he falsely claimed Daniel had declined contact, whether such a decision could be reversed later if Daniel changed his mind. The caseworker's note confirms Richard was told yes, it could be reversed at any time at Daniel's request. Richard never mentioned this option to Daniel either. Linda has said this specific detail, more than the lie itself, was what convinced her this had not been a single moment of poor judgment. Richard had been given an explicit, low-stakes way to leave the door open for Daniel's future self to decide. He chose instead to close it as completely as the procedure allowed, and to never tell Daniel a door had existed at all. Carol, when asked directly during the events of this story whether she had known about this second contact attempt at the time, gave an answer that was different from anything she had admitted 12 months earlier. Victoria Hale has said that for 9 years she carried a specific, particular kind of grief, not the general grief of having given up a child at 19, which she had by her own account, made a kind of peace with over time, but a sharper, more personal grief tied to a single fact she believed to be true, that her son, now an adult, fully capable of finding her if he wanted to, had been asked, and had said no. She has said she spent years building a private narrative around that rejection, telling herself it made sense, that perhaps the life Richard and Carol had given him was full enough that he simply didn't need anything more, that his decision, whatever pain it caused her, deserved to be respected rather than revisited. She stopped lighting an additional candle on the anniversary of that contact attempt, a small private ritual she had started and then deliberately ended, because continuing it felt, to her, like refusing to accept a decision that wasn't hers to relitigate. Victoria did not attempt contact again after that year, not because she stopped caring, but specifically because she believed, based entirely on Richard's fabricated account, that a third attempt would be disrespecting an adult son's clearly stated wishes. The lie did not just cost 9 years. It actively shaped Victoria's subsequent choices, convincing her to stop trying at the exact moment continued effort might have closed the distance years earlier. When Daniel finally did call her, 14 months before the events of this story, Victoria has said she felt something she has since had difficulty fully articulating. Joy, immediately and completely real, layered uncomfortably over a confusion she didn't examine closely at the time, a quiet, unprocessed question about why, if he'd declined contact at 25, he was calling now at 34. She has said she assumed, reasonably, that people simply change. She had no reason yet to suspect the change had never actually been Daniel's to make. That unprocessed question was still sitting in the back of Victoria's mind 14 months later when Linda Morales called her with the answer. Linda Morales had agreed, 8 months after first reconnecting Daniel with Victoria, to assist the county adoption agency with a broader compliance audit of older, pre-digital case files, unrelated, on its face, to Daniel's case specifically, which had already been fully resolved from the agency's perspective. The audit was prompted by a new state record-keeping requirement, not by anything connected to the Foster family. Linda has said she nearly skipped past Daniel's file entirely, since it had already been closed out the previous year. She pulled it only because the audit protocol required a full chronological review of every contact request ever logged on a case, regardless of current status. And she noticed, almost in passing, a contact entry dated 9 years earlier that she did not remember processing herself and did not recall ever discussing with Daniel during his original outreach. The entry was brief. Contact request received from birth parent, guardian contacted per protocol, guardian report subject previously declined contact, request closed. Linda has said her first reaction was simple confusion. Daniel had told her, repeatedly, during their original conversations, that he had never been told anything about his birth mother before finding the folder in his garage. The file in front of her suggested he had been told, and had responded 9 years earlier. Linda pulled the original caseworker's handwritten notes from the agency's physical archive to see exactly how that conversation had been documented. What she found there did not match what Daniel had told her at all. Linda contacted Deborah Chen, the agency's current records compliance director, and a colleague Linda had trained early in Deborah's career, to help her interpret the older file format and confirm she wasn't misreading outdated agency shorthand. Deborah pulled the complete digitized version of the file, including a scanned copy of the original handwritten caseworker notes from the year in question. The handwritten notes recorded a phone call between the caseworker and Richard Foster, lasting approximately 11 minutes, in which Richard stated directly that Daniel had been informed of Victoria's identity and had explicitly declined any contact. The notes also recorded Richard's specific follow-up question about whether the decision could be reversed later, and the caseworker's confirmation that it could be, at Daniel's initiation, at any time. Deborah has said that in her 15 years reviewing agency records, she has seen guardians decline contact on a minor's behalf, and she has seen guardians fail to pass along information out of genuine uncertainty about timing or readiness. She has said she had never, before this file, seen a case where a guardian appeared to have actively fabricated an adult subject's own stated decision, particularly not after going to the trouble of asking and being told that the decision was reversible. Linda now had to decide whether to tell Daniel something that could not be walked back once it was said. She has admitted she sat with that file, unopened on her desk, for 3 full days before she finally called him. Linda called Daniel on a Tuesday evening, the same way she had called him 14 months earlier with Victoria's contact information. She has said the 2 calls felt nothing alike. The first had been the best news she had ever delivered in her career. This one, she has said, she dreaded specifically because she didn't know what it would do to a reconciliation that, from everything she had heard, was finally working. Daniel has said Linda was unusually careful with her words on that call, more so than he had ever heard her before, which told him something significant was coming before she said a single specific detail. When she finally explained what she had found, the falsified decline, the reversible decision detail, the 9 years it had cost, Daniel has said he didn't respond for almost 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his first question was not about Richard. It was about Victoria, specifically, whether she knew yet. Linda told him she had called Victoria directly beforehand, since the discovery affected her as much as it affected him, and that Victoria had asked Linda to let Daniel be the one to decide how, or whether, to discuss it with Richard directly. Daniel sat in his car outside his North Carolina office for nearly an hour after that call ended. He has said it was the first time since the events of the previous year that he seriously questioned whether any relationship with Richard was salvageable at all, not because of new anger, but because of the specific, calculated nature of what Richard had done. Victoria has said that learning the truth produced a strange, delayed kind of pain, not the immediate shock of new bad news, but the slower, more corrosive realization that 9 years of a grief she had carefully, deliberately made peace with had been grief over something that had never actually happened. She has said she found herself re-experiencing, almost involuntarily, specific moments from those 9 years. A birthday she had spent unusually low, a passing thought she'd had at Daniel's age 26, 27, 28, always wondering briefly whether he ever thought about changing his mind, now recontextualized as grief for a decision that was never his. Victoria has said, "I spent 9 years respecting a choice my son never made. I don't know what to do with the version of myself that existed during those years. She wasn't wrong to feel what she felt. She was just grieving the wrong thing." Victoria did not ask Daniel to confront Richard on her behalf. She told him instead that whatever he decided to do next needed to be entirely his decision, because she had already learned the hard way what happens when someone else gets to decide what a person is told about their own life. Daniel called Michael before he called either of his parents, a decision he has said came from wanting to know, clearly, where his brother actually stood before deciding how to handle the rest of it. He told Michael everything Linda had found. He asked him directly, the same way he had asked about the original adoption secret a year earlier, whether he had known about this specific lie. Michael's answer was different this time, and Daniel has said he believed it immediately, in a way he hadn't fully been able to with the first secret. Michael told him he had not known, that he had been 28 that year, recently married and living several states away for a postdoctoral position, with limited contact with his parents during that specific period. Phone records and Michael's own calendar from that year, which he offered to Daniel without being asked, supported the timeline. Michael told Daniel without hesitation that regardless of whether he had known about this specific incident, he understood completely why Daniel might no longer extend him the benefit of the doubt on anything related to their parents. He told Daniel he supported whatever decision he made about Richard, including, explicitly, if that decision was permanent. Daniel has said Michael's willingness to support a complete severance with their parents, even though it would inevitably complicate Michael's own relationship with Richard and Carol, was the moment he finally, fully believed his brother was actually on his side, rather than simply managing his own guilt. Daniel did not call Richard directly. He drove to Ohio without warning, a deliberate choice, he has said, because he no longer trusted a phone call to convey what he needed Richard to understand, and because he wanted to watch his father's face when he said it. He arrived at the house on a Saturday morning, parked in the driveway he had not parked in since the eviction 14 months earlier, and knocked on a door he had once had his own key to. Daniel has said clearly and repeatedly in subsequent interviews that he did not drive to Ohio hoping for reconciliation. He drove there because he believed, after everything, that Richard deserved to hear directly from him exactly what had been discovered, and exactly what it was going to cost him, not as an act of cruelty, but because Daniel had decided he was no longer willing to let any part of this story happen at a distance, the way so much of his life with the Fosters had. Carol opened the door. Daniel has said her face, seeing him standing there unannounced, told him she already suspected exactly why he had come. Richard came to the door behind Carol, and Daniel has said he watched his father's expression shift, in real time, from surprise to something more guarded, as though some part of Richard understood immediately that this was not a social visit. Daniel did not go inside. He has said he made a specific decision to have this conversation on the porch, the same porch where the eviction had happened 14 months earlier, because he wanted the symmetry to be unmistakable. Daniel told Richard exactly what Linda had found. The falsified decline, the question about reversibility, the caseworker's confirmation that Richard had been told explicitly that the door could be reopened at any time at Daniel's request. He told Richard that Victoria had spent 9 years grieving a rejection that had never actually happened, because of a story Richard had invented in an 11-minute phone call. Richard's first response, according to Daniel's account, was not denial. It was, "I did what I thought was right at the time." Daniel asked him directly, what about telling the agency his own son had made a decision Daniel had never been given the chance to make, could possibly have qualified, in Richard's mind, as right? Richard did not have an answer to that specific question. He repeated, instead, a version of the same sentence, as though repetition might eventually make it sufficient. Carol, standing slightly behind Richard, said nothing this time, a detail Daniel has said struck him as different from the silence he remembered from the eviction. This silence, he has said, felt less like complicity and more like someone who had simply run out of ways to soften something that could no longer be softened. Daniel asked Richard one final question before he turned to leave. He asked whether Richard would have ever told him the truth, about any of it, if Linda hadn't found the file by accident during an unrelated audit. Richard's answer, or lack of one, was the last thing Daniel needed to hear. Richard did not answer the question. Daniel has said he waited deliberately for nearly 10 full seconds, long enough that the silence itself became its own answer, more complete than any sentence Richard could have constructed. Daniel has said he felt something settle in him during those 10 seconds, a clarity he had been circling for 14 months finally arriving in full. Daniel told Richard, calmly and without raising his voice, that he was done, not done being angry, which he said would probably take longer to resolve than he could.